300 food additives are allowed in Europe. Among them, aspartame, an artificial sweetener which we find in at least 6,000 everyday products such as soft drinks, sugar-free products, tabletop sweeteners, chewing gum, but also in medicine. The story of aspartame is typical. We find all the techniques used by the industry to manipulate the regulatory process. Everything started in 1965, when a researcher from the pharmaceutical company G.D. Searle discovered the molecule by chance. 9 years later, the company submitted a pre-marketing approval request to the Food and Drug Administration. In 1981, the FDA approved the product under the name NutraSweet with an ADI of 50 milligrams.
Do you think aspartame is safe?
Yes, I do.
You do. When the FDA established the ADI of aspartame, on which studies was it based? I mean, it was a Searle studies submitted by the manufacturer?
That's right.
This is the heart of the problem. The tests submitted by Searle to obtain the homologation for aspartame were subject to heated debate in the 70s, ignited by John Olney, a neurologist, whom we see here giving a press conference in 1996, 15 years after aspartame was put on the market.
The article we've just published shows an increased incidence of brain tumors and an increased malignancy of brain tumors in human populations in the United States starting about 3 years after aspartame was introduced.
What kind of studies did you carry out on aspartame?
Well, that was back in about 1971, and actually the first study I did was with aspartate, which is not aspartame. Aspartame is a combination of 2 amino acids, aspartate and phenylalanine. And I had shown that the aspartate component by itself destroys nerve cells just like monosodium glutamate does. So I asked G.D. Searle to send me a sample of aspartame, which they did, and I fed it to infant mice, and it caused the same brain damage that aspartate and glutamate cause.
But if aspartame is really inducing brain tumors, it's a big health issue. And why did the FDA approve aspartame?
Because FDA is not doing its job in that regard.
The way the FDA managed the aspartame case is indeed troubling. I managed to gain access to the internal archives of the agency thanks to the tenacity of Betty Martini, who has set up a documentation center on aspartame called Mission Possible International. She has collected incriminating evidence obtained thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, a procedure that allows any American citizen to have access to government documents. That's how I found out that, alerted by John Olney, the FDA set up 2 internal investigations to assess the validity of the data provided by Searle. Finally, in August 1977, Dr. Jerome Bressler wrote a very critical report denouncing all the irregularities of the firm's studies. Here is an extract. Observation records indicated that animal A23LM was alive at week 88, dead from week 92 through week 104, alive at week 108, and dead at week 112. Then the FDA set up a public inquiry board that completed its report on the 30th of September, 1980. The board concludes that approval of aspartame for use in foods should be withheld, at least until the question concerning its possible oncogenic potential has been resolved by further experiments. The irregularities observed by the FDA scientists were confirmed during hearings organized by Congress in 1987, and in particular by Jacqueline Verrett, one of the agency's toxicologists.
There's no doubt about it. NutraSweet has captured the hearts and the taste buds of the American consumer. Dr. Verrett, we're happy to hear from you.
Thank you, Senator Metzenbaum. I have no qualms in saying that if we are basing the amount of aspartame that we're putting in all of these foods today on these studies, then it is a disaster. I feel that as a minimum, they are seriously flawed because of enough problems in the way they conducted that it makes it difficult to interpret them and come up with any kind of a figure in which we could have confidence for an ADI.
I spoke before about your colleague, Dr. Verrett. She wrote this book here, Eating Maybe Hazardous to Your Health. And maybe you can open the page 96. I would like to have your comment. You have been working here for a long time. She says it's not that government decisions makers are corrupt. It's a good thing. But their sense of duty is constantly eroded by the industry contacts and the consideration of short-term effects on industry instead of long-term effects on consumers. Do you think it's accurate?
No.
You don't agree with her?
No, I don't agree with her. I don't think that any of us in the FDA would feel that we're doing our job adequately and appropriately if we didn't put consumer safety ahead of any kind of consideration of industry, well-being. That's turning the whole safety assessment paradigm on its head. No, I disagree with that completely.
And yet, during the congressional hearings in which David Hatton took part, we discover a surprising proximity between some of the managers of the FDA and Searle, which from 1976 to 1990 was run by a certain Donald Rumsfeld, the year Ronald Reagan was elected to the White House.
Between 1979 and 1982, 4 FDA officials who participated in the approval process took jobs linked to the NutraSweet industry. Pape, acting FDA Commissioner Sherwin Gardner, Albert Colby, who was Associate Director for Toxicology, and Mike Taylor, an FDA lawyer who represented the Bureau before the Board of Inquiry. We have here is not a legal conflict of interest, but a revolving door.
What was the role of Donald Rumsfeld in this approval process?
Donald Rumsfeld left the government when Gerald Ford lost the presidency. He had been the head, the Secretary of Defense, the Chief Defense Minister. And he went to work as the president of the Searle Drug Company. Searle Drug Company was in the congressional district that he represented when he was in Congress. The Searle family is a very prominent family, supported him all through his political life. He went to work for them. Reagan's elected. Donald Rumsfeld is on the transition team for Reagan's presidency. And he is the guy that manipulates who's going to be FDA commissioner. That new commissioner came in, and then the process started to where he unraveled all of the work of the scientists and then said, NutraSweet is safe.
I like to do well at things. It's important to me that if you're given an assignment that you try to do it the best you can.
And that's how aspartame flooded the American market a few weeks after Ronald Reagan's election. The FDA's decision, as if by magic, was copy-pasted abroad.
I need a taste. Ooh, give me just a taste.
NutraSweet. Why so many things taste so good.
I want to taste, yeah.
I was able to consult the archives of the JECFA at the WHO. From 1975 to 1979, the expert committee refused to establish an ADI for aspartame, as the FDA had at the same time. For example, the 1978 report mentions that because of a doubt as to the validity of the original data, the committee has delayed its decision. Change of tone in 1980, when the experts decided to fix the ADI at 40 milligrams per kilogram. In an annex to the report, they added the studies upon which they had based their decision. These are the 3 Searle studies. The ADI fixed by the JECFA was adopted on trust by the European countries, and in particular the EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority.
Cette dose journalière acceptable de 40 mg par kilo a été établie au départ par le JECFA, c'est-à-dire le groupe d'experts international FAO-MS, et c'était en 1980. Et ensuite, la même DJA a été établie également par le comité scientifique de l'alimentation humaine, donc pour l'Europe, en 1985.
Alors, moi, je suis allée à l'OMS et j'ai fouillé dans les archives du JECFA et j'ai eu accès aux documents. C'est très troublant, je dois dire. Cette première DJA de 40 mg est basée sur une étude hautement controversée et on n'est jamais revenu dessus, même si, encore une fois, les études de départ sont hautement critiquables.
Enfin, je ne sais pas ce qu'il faut penser des études initiales. Moi, je n'ai pas les éléments pour juger plus que ce que je peux lire dans les évaluations précédentes. Et dans les évaluations précédentes, il est mentionné qu'un doute a été soulevé et que ce doute a été levé.
Oui, mais dans les dossiers, il n'y a pas de nouvelles études pour expliquer pourquoi ce doute est levé. Voilà.
Sur quelque chose qui a été fait il y a effectivement 30 ans, c'est peut-être regrettable, mais c'est souvent le cas.
In the meantime, the domino effect was a godsend to the industry. That's what Robert Shapiro's testimony stipulated. He was the president of NutraSweet, a subsidiary of Searle, which was later sold to Monsanto in 1985. Who's going to verify that his statements are based on nothing?
Thank you, Senator. Those who attack the safety of aspartame are also attacking the independent determinations of the health and regulatory authorities of the world. The fact is, Senator, that every single authoritative scientific, medical, and regulatory body in the United States and around the world that has ever examined the scientific evidence on the safety of aspartame has each independently and separately arrived at a single identical conclusion, and that is that aspartame is safe.
FDA received many complaints related to aspartame. I have here a list which is public. It's your list of adverse effects. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of adverse effects. 92, many complaints, hundreds, thousands of complaints, headache, dizziness, convulsions, vomiting, change in vision. Don't you think it's worrisome, this list of adverse effects?
As a matter of fact, both the FDA and Searle and then later NutraSweet, a second succeeding company with aspartame, did additional studies, clinical studies, to evaluate some of these things like headache, the contribution to seizures, that sort of thing. They were carefully tested, and what you find is in a controlled environment where you know what the dose is, you know the timing of the dose, you know the individual, you simply do not see these effects replicated. They are not reproduced.
To the best of my knowledge, GD Searle hasn't done the appropriate studies to determine whether aspartame is causing disturbances in the central nervous system.
Dr. Walton.
Thanks, Ron. Good morning, folks. Over the past 12 years, my patients have taught me that aspartame can trigger a wide variety of problems. I believe that in vulnerable populations, it can lead to grand mal seizures, depression, panic attacks. I did a survey of the world's medical literature on aspartame and found 164 fulfilled the criteria for publication in a peer-reviewed journal with clear-cut relevance for issues of human safety. Of the 164, 74 were funded by the industry, that is the aspartame-related industry. All 74 attested to its safety. And what we found was really quite remarkable. There was virtually 100% correlation between outcome and funding source. And that is, all of the industry-funded studies said there was no problem. It was completely safe. And 100% of the truly independent studies said, look, there is a problem with the substance.
How do you explain that?
Tragically, that money is very powerful.
The argument is serious because it suggests that scientists can be bribed by the industry to conduct biased studies. To make sure, I knocked on the door of a prestigious institution, the American Cancer Society, whose ties to the industry have often been criticized.
It's definitely true that industries that are going to be potentially affected by an adverse finding try to influence certainly the political opinion and the public relations campaign, and they also, in some cases, try to influence the research.
There are good studies and there are terrible studies. And quite often, the studies that are sponsored by industry are designed in such a way that it's virtually impossible to find any adverse effect. So what does that mean? That means then that the scientific literature gets polluted with studies that are done improperly.
Basically, it would be a very good idea if people who are studying drugs didn't get money from drug companies, and if people who are studying particular pollutants weren't being paid by the industry that produces those.
But it's not the case right now.
Right now, it's common practice.
Do you have an example of industry intimidating regulators when...
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, I was a regulator for 24 years. And if they can't beat you on the science, then they resort to personal attacks. I experienced that personally. So they wanted to have me removed from my job. And the reason they wanted to have me removed from my job is because I was doing my job. So there are many people in government that unfortunately, are required to change interpretations that they don't believe in. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But it's difficult a lot of times because of the economic situations that scientists are in, and they're being intimidated to do less or not to speak out.
Unfortunately, there are few research centers that are completely independent and protected from the pressures of industry. This is the case for the European Foundation Ramazzini, a private institute specialized in environmental cancer research. The researchers there have carried out 2 studies on aspartame. The first, published in 2005, conducted tests on 1,800 rats that ingested a dose of aspartame close to the ADI from the age of 8 weeks to their natural death. The result? A significant increase of lymphoma and leukemia in the female population. The second study was carried out on 400 pregnant rats, whose offspring were followed until death. This study confirmed the first one, with a significant increase of mammary cancer. But strangely, both these studies were rejected by the FDA and EFSA.
Do you consider aspartame is carcinogen?
Sulla base dei nostri dati sicuramente cancerogeno per gli animali sperimentali.
Il y a un certain nombre, pour ne pas dire un nombre certain, d'insuffisances méthodologiques qui ont été relevées à propos de ces études.
Par exemple?
Alors, en particulier, le fait que les rats qui ont fait l'objet de ces études présentaient pour une bonne part des pathologies respiratoires.
Non siamo d'accordo per una serie di motivi. Il primo perché i processi infiammatori che noi osserviamo nei nostri animali molto spesso dipende dal fatto che noi lasciamo morire i nostri animali spontaneamente e quindi non interrompiamo arbitrariamente la loro vita. E come succede per l'uomo, nell'ultima fase della vita, nella fase terminale della vita, le complicanze polmonari sia polmonari che renali sono le più comuni e quindi trovare infiammazioni sia a livello renale che a livello polmonare è molto frequente.
La maladie respiratoire est à l'origine de tumeurs et donc peut complètement brouiller les pistes. Et c'est exactement ce qui s'est passé dans cette étude.
Did you find this chronic inflammatory lung disease in the control group as well?
Ovviamente, sia per quanto riguarda sia nei gruppi trattati che nei gruppi di controllo. La differenza era dovuta soltanto dal fatto che i gruppi trattati assumevano aspartame e invece i gruppi di controllo no.
Oui, mais de toute façon, je vous dis, la majorité des résultats de ces études ont été invalidés par les analyses qu'en ont faites les experts du comité de l'EFSA.
To be honest, EFSA's arguments didn't really convince me. I was intrigued to find out who the 21 members of the EFSA Food Additive Committee are. Each EFSA expert has recently been required to officially declare any conflict of interest. There we see that John Christian Larson, the chairman of the committee, works for ILSI, an institute funded by food processing and chemical multinationals, and that Jürgen Koenig has contracts with Dannon, and that Dominic Parent-Masson works for the Japanese company Ajinomoto, one of the biggest aspartame manufacturers, and for Coca-Cola, a great user of aspartame.
J'ai vérifié qui étaient les 21 membres du comité additif alimentaire. J'ai vu notamment qu'il y avait Dominique Parent-Masson, qui est membre du groupe de travail scientifique du fabricant d'aspartame japonais Ajinomoto. Alors ça, par exemple, c'est un vrai conflit d'intérêt.
Donc ça veut dire que quand nous avons fait l'évaluation, quand nous faisons l'évaluation de l'aspartame, cet expert ne peut pas être rapporteur, ne peut pas préparer l'avis du groupe et ne peut pas participer aux délibérations sur ce sujet parce qu'il y a un conflit d'intérêts.
Et là, par exemple, dans le cas de l'avis qui a été rendu sur l'aspartame en mars 2009, si je me souviens, le dernier, donc Dominique Parent-Masson n'a pas participé.
Non, sa déclaration d'intérêt a été évaluée et il a été considéré qu'elle avait un conflit d'intérêt. Et d'ailleurs, elle se restreint aussi, elle ne participe pas, par exemple, à certaines activités de l'EFSA en rapport avec l'aspartame d'elle-même, je dirais, en addition du processus, j'allais dire, que nous avons mis en place pour faire l'évaluation des déclarations d'intérêt.
Apparently, transparency has its limits. Dominique Parent-Masson's interest declaration that I had seen on the EFSA website before carrying out my interviews has since disappeared. It has been replaced by a new one, which doesn't mention any of her links with Ajinomoto and Coca-Cola. Strange coincidence.
Un alto dirigente di EFSA mi disse una volta, dottor Soffritti, se noi ammettessimo che i risultati della sua sperimentazione sono validi, noi dovremmo bandire l'aspartame da domani mattina. Lei si rende conto che questo non è possibile.
If they admit they've ever made a mistake, then there may be a reduction in trust, but also I think it would, as they might say, open the floodgates to people saying, well, maybe you made not just one mistake, but several mistakes, and maybe the entire process was flawed.
Maybe the entire process is flawed. At this stage in my